Welcome to the lecture on integrated analysis, part of the data visualization lecture series. A large part of our conversation in this lecture will be about what's known as the knowledge generation model. What this is a model that provides the different aspects of how a human is in the loop and how we can move from the human being in the loop to the human is the loop, which is a way of saying, how do we integrate human visualization or visual processing capabilities into a larger knowledge generation model that uses algorithms and different types of analytical processing. So as you can see, the model that's presented here, we have our standard computer model over on the left-hand side where we have data, we'll have a particular model, and we may be visualizing that model. And there may be some kind of iteration where we are fine-tuning the model from the visualization and having output from the model that we can experience using the visualization. From there, we go through what's known as the exploration loop, where there's a process of finding and then action. Then we go through the verification loop, where there's identification of insights, testing of hypothesis, and then finally the knowledge generation loop. And so we'll begin to talk about each one of these loops and aspects of the knowledge generation model. The knowledge generation model for visual analytics has no clear separation between the computer and the human. The idea is that computers often miss the creativity and perception of human analysis, the ability of humans to find surprising, subtle, or hidden connections between data and the problem domain. On the flip side of it, our computers or algorithms are very good at efficiently and effectively dealing with large amounts of data. So they can chew through a lot of processing that humans cannot process in the same way. So the idea behind it is that we're marrying up this creativity and unique perceptive capabilities of human analysis with the raw processing power of algorithms. So starting first with the computer or algorithmic, we have data. So we've discussed data before in the course, and our data can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. We create, gather, and select data for analysis. So regardless of what type of structure it is, we're going to perform some sort of process where we may be creating or generating the data, framing it up, and integrating that into some type of model for decision making. In order for it to be data or considered appropriate data, it must be representative and related to the analytical problem that we're trying to solve. And also, data quality is important to validate the trustworthiness of the results. So those observations and measurements that are a part of the data have to be validated so we have a lot of confidence that this data is representative of the phenomenon. So once we get our data figured out, we then move on to the model. And we can have lots of different kinds of models. We can have simple models, statistical testing, testing hypothesis. We can also have more complex models. So clustering, classification, and we can also use the output of those visually to derive insights. Visualization and its integration with the model is an enhancement. It creates this improvement loop with the statistical modeling that allows us to optimize and fit models a lot better. So it's a feedback loop for us and helps us to build and create models. And as well, it helps us to find complex patterns or abstractions. That's what the model is for. Now, visualization in and of itself can provide that primary interface between the human analyst and the visual analytic system or the model. So whatever that system is that is working through the data, our visualization can be basically our human-computer interaction with that model. Visualization enables analysts to detect relationships in the data. So the model can be doing some of the detecting, but we also have to visualize it, and the human has to cognitively understand what the visualization is, what's being communicated by the model for it to have meaning. So things like clustering a group, plotting a box plot, semantic zooming, all of these are different features. We might call them more officially task abstractions that visualization provides. So now that we've discussed what the computer algorithmic scope is, that brings us to the exploration loop. So the purpose of the exploration loop is the finding. We're sort of trying to discover here. We're looking for any interesting observation or a pattern, and that pattern may be expected or unexpected by the analyst. This exploration process does not always lead to new insights, but it certainly could trigger further actions. We need to make some adjustments in the visualization. The way that this sample is being represented does or does not let us see what we think might be interesting. And, pointing to where we're going next, insights, which will be brought forward in the verification loop, we declare that we've identified insights when the analyst understands or interprets a finding from the exploration loop. So you can think about it as we have this discovery or exploration loop. We're figuring things out, and when we think we figured something out, we think we see something, we might determine that to be an insight and move on to the verification loop. Now, in terms of actions in the exploration loop, there could be many different individual tasks derived from our findings. So we might determine that we require some changes in the preparation of our data, or we need to manipulate the data in certain ways. Maybe we need to look at the mean or the median, or we need to look at a sum, or we need to provide some type of division or roll up or drill down. So all of these actions are part of this model building and usage process. This is how we make adjustments to the model. So we might do some visual mapping, interactive exploration, and any of a number of different tasks or interrogations help us figure out what's going on inside the model as represented by the visualization. Now we move on to the verification loop. So our verification loop is, as it sounds like, we're trying to verify that what we think we've found is actually the case. So the types of things that we're doing in the verification loop is we're confirming a hypothesis, or we're disproving a hypothesis, or we're creating a new hypothesis. It can be any of these, but we're trying to get a lot closer to defining what it is that we're seeing. So it's a confirmatory analysis that we conduct to verify or falsify the hypothesis, or to develop some evidence that's supporting or discounting a particular hypothesis. So our insights that have emerged may be related to the examined hypothesis, but they may not be as well. So at this stage, or in this verification loop, we may try and confirm a hypothesis from insights that have come out of the exploration loop, but we may also see something different that we didn't expect to see. And it may open, this verification loop may open new questions. And so a lot of this work, centers around the traditional role that the hypothesis has played. It's an assumption about a particular problem domain that we wish to analyze. We run statistical tests or data visualizations, both different analytical techniques against the hypothesis. When we create a hypothesis, often it has a vague nature to it, and it's seeking clarification. When we determine that we have an insight, it's something that is complex, deep, quantitative, unexpected, and relevant that goes beyond an individual observation of data. So as we put good definitions around our terms, we might define an insight by what it's not. So it's not just a single observation. It would be two or more, a collection of data points or observations that are pointing in a particular direction. And then we come to the knowledge generation loop. So in the knowledge generation loop, this is where we begin to take our past knowledge to help inform our analysis strategy. So what is it that we know? We begin to use the scientific method to build one finding on top of another. Now, the definition of knowledge that's applied to visual analytics is what we might call a justified belief. So we've moved beyond sort of establishing evidence. We've organized that evidence, and now we have a certain belief about the phenomenon that is rooted in the evidence that we found. The analyst, of course, will decide whether there is sufficient evidence to trust an insight and accept it as knowledge. So there's a researcher's responsibility here, a scientist's responsibility, that if we are going to call it knowledge, that there's significant or sufficient evidence to stand on for that insight to stand on. That in an objective analysis, a majority of equally trained people would conclude the same. And it helps us to gather experience with the visual analytics system and methodology. So, the knowledge generation loop is an experience gathering system. It's an approach that says, what do we know? And then it begins to add to or layer on what are our additional knowledge that we've created. What do we now know having gone through exploration process and verified? And then here we have a conversation about how do we perform our knowledge model integration. Now, as many of you have learned before, there are several different kinds of processes in the creation of what we might call knowledge. And so what we presented here are two different models. The model on the bottom left, the KDD process, many of you guys may have reviewed previously or learned about as the model for data mining, where we go through a process of selection, we target particular data, we pre-process that target data, we move it through a transformation, and then we statistically mine that transformed data to find patterns. And the subject is well taught in many courses. We combine that with, and of course we can compare it as well, but often we combine that with what we've learned as our InfoVis pipeline, our information visualization pipeline, where we take raw data, we perform transformations, we structure those transformations into data tables. We then perform visual mappings and come up with visual structures. We might also call those encoding or visual encoding that we might associate with marks and Tableau. Then we go through a process of view transformations where we're creating an entire picture or view that is a collection of visual structures or visualization shapes and objects. Now, the idea behind integrated analysis is that there are two streams of analysis. There's statistical analysis and there's visualization analysis. And both of these are equivalent, appropriate, and yet unique approaches for analyzing data. And I would want you guys to think about them as parallel tracks. You could use either of these models to analyze a data set. And then you could also come back and use the power of each of these in an integrated way to improve or provide the absolute advantages, best advantages of each of these processes. And that's what we're looking at in integrated analysis or knowledge model integration. We do some refining of the data. We might do some manipulation, and then we engage the statistical analysis, which you guys will do in your assignment. You'll do all the data setup and refining and structuring in Tableau, but then you're going to engage a statistical analysis where Tableau will, through an interface, engage R, perform that statistical analysis, and then provide the results of that statistical analysis back to Tableau so that Tableau can visualize the results of the statistical analysis. And so what you end up getting is kind of the best of both worlds. You get, the highest grade of statistical analysis that's visualized with the highest grade of visualization software. So, our goal here is to kind of provide you guys with an integrated working model to produce, very accurate and high quality results, and sort of understand, said a different way, how to make these visualization tools work seamlessly with our data mining or statistical analysis tools. And so as we can see on the right-hand side, we've discussed our exploration, verification, knowledge generation loop. And more broadly, when we engage the human in this looping process, we're engaging a process that's known as sense making. And sense making has pretty broad amount of research, both management as well as visualization, peer-reviewed research. So for those that are interested in it, I would provide the recommendation. You can do some simple Google Scholar searches on visualization and sense making, and you can come up with a great number of articles on this subject. Now, it's important for us to do a little bit of overview and gain a little bit deeper understanding of RStudio, since we're going to be using that as our tool set for statistical analysis. Now, I get asked a lot, does it have to be R, and is R the only thing? The answer to that is no. I mean, what I can share with you guys is that I've done lots of different, side-by-side comparisons, SAS, SPSS, and R, and routinely, regardless of the problem or data set that I've submitted to those tools and tested them side-by-side, they produce identical results. So, there's almost, in terms of the, accuracy and validity of the output of those three tool sets, they're pretty much all the same. The main difference is sort of the emerging desire of employers wanting, graduates and professionals to have experience in RStudio because it is an open source product. And as you guys will see and experience, it's pretty well integrated with some other tool sets like Tableau, and I think more recently there's a push to try and integrate R with Python as well as some other languages. So what we're looking at here in RStudio is sort of our main interaction directly with R. So if we wanted to just use R, not even considering anything to do with Tableau, this is what it would look like. We have our text editor up on top where we can edit particular R code for command line functions that we want to execute. Down in the console, that's our real-time execution of R functions. In the top right-hand corner, that's where we can see our folder and file structures that we're using for RStudio, where we want to engage particular data sets. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, where we would display different packages or plots that we're doing in RStudio. Now, when we start using R, we need to familiarize ourselves with sort of the way data is structured and the way R likes to use data. And probably the best place to start there is with the data frame. So the data frame is the most general and basic data structure in R that provides a list of variables with the same number of rows. The language and the terms used in R are slightly different than what some may be used to. So often when we talk about analysis and hypothesis testing, we use the term variables. And so in our picture here at the center of the screen, we might have variables like miles per gallon, or MPG, in the first column, number of cylinders in the second column, displacement in the third column, horsepower in the fourth column. Then we might have additional variables. We have weight out there to the right. And these are known, commonly as variables. But within R, we call these vectors. So this is an important sort of working with R definition, that variables are no longer called variables. They're called vectors. And our data frame is what we use for storing data tables. So as you can see here, we have our different vectors, also known as variables. And then we have a number of rows. Our rows, there we have a Mazda RX-4, looks like RX-4 wagon, and a Datsun 710. And so each one of the different models that we have might represent a different row of data in our data frame. Now in our data frame example, our built-in data frame here is known as MT-CARS. There's not necessarily any magic around that. It's just what we named this particular data frame. We could call it anything you wanted. We could call it your first name, or cool cars, or my cars, or fun cars, or economy cars, or whatever it is that we want to call. Each data frame will have a particular name. Once we have that name, once we've defined that name for a data frame, we can then interrogate our data set here in the following manner. So if you look in the middle of the screen, we want to ask the question of, well, how many rows is in our data set? So we might type in row, which is short for number of rows, and then the data frame name, MT-CARS. And when we type that in, of course, R will return the result in the console that gives us an answer. In this case, it's 32 rows. We could also ask questions about, hey, tell me the value in a particular cell, right? So there in the bottom left, we're curious about what is the value in the first row, second column of MT-CARS. So in this case, first row is Mazda RX-4. And the second column is number of cylinders. And you'll see I have that circled for you. And the data value that would be returned is, of course, 6. And if we preferred, we could also, instead of defining the row number and column number, we could specifically identify the titles, which we've done here on the bottom right. MT-CARS bracket, and we put the exact title or name, Mazda space RX-4 in parentheses, and then we did the same thing with CYL for the exact title of the second column. And of course, it returns the exact same information. Now, another type of data structure that we will use for particular functions inside of R is called a matrix. So in this case, what we will do is we will often create a matrix using a data frame file. So we might come back and say, hey, I want to create this matrix of data. I'll say, B equals the matrix, and I'll define here is a series of data, 2, 4, 3, 1, 5, and 7. We've got some data values there. And then we'll define number of rows, and then we'll define the number of columns. So in this case, we provided for 3 rows and 2 columns. And then you'll notice if we interrogate B, once we've created that matrix, you'll see that it returns the data elements 2, 4, and 3 as the first 3 rows in column 1, and then 1, 5, and 7 as the first 3 rows in the second column. And should we want to transpose that, basically swap axes is another way of describing that. We can simply type the function T for transpose and put the name of our matrix, and you'll see that it transposes, and now we have 2 rows and 3 columns. basically having swapped the axes. Now let's head into how are we going to work with R. Particularly as you guys look to your assignment, how are you going to start working and what are the major functions and tasks you need to accomplish in R? So the first thing you'll do is you're going to open a new project in R. So the first thing it'll ask you to do is define a new directory. Of course, if you've already been working in a directory, you'd select your existing directory, but in this case, we're going to define our new directory. We'll then select an empty project because we don't have one yet, so we'll basically select this empty project so that we can create a project. And then we'll provide a name for the directory. So whatever we want to call this particular analysis, we will provide that in the directory name, and then we'll save the new project. And of course, we can change the subdirectory that we want to write this particular directory name to. Then we'll wrap up with clicking on the button of Create Project. Now from there, we'll want to create an analysis file. So we will create a new file in R. So we will identify our analysis file, give it a particular name, and click on Save. And then we'll see that show up in the top right window. Now, as an example, we might place a file. In this particular case, the name of our file is irish.csv and our new directory. So once we've defined that directory, we will read in our CSV file and save that within R in our directory. In this case, you'll see in red there in the center of the screen, the object iris is of the type data frame, and we check the class of object. If we want to determine, well, what is a particular class, or we want to define a class, we can put it in parentheses. And in this case, we might define a class like iris. This is a file, and we have a particular class of iris, because we might have several different data files within this class of iris. Which brings us to a particular statistical technique. So what we're going to do with R is we're going to take that data set and then apply a statistical analysis technique. And in this case, we're going to work with k-means clustering. When we use k-means clustering, what we're doing is dividing observations into discrete groups based on what's known as a distance metric from the mean. So if you think about a whole bunch of plotted points and we want to solve for the problem, which one of these plotted points goes together? Which of these plotted points go into a group or into one group versus another group? And the way that the algorithm works is it measures all the distances from the mean. So the user specifies the number of clusters or groups that they'd like to see, and then we execute it as k-means. We define the data set and then the number of clusters that we'd like to see. So more simply put, with specifics, we want to run k-means. Our data set is iris, and the number of clusters, also known as centers, that we want is 3. And so here's a simple application of clustering. We applied the function, ran it, and then here we happen to be using the ggplot visualization package that is available within R to plot this. And the things that we're plotting are 2 different parts of the flower. So a measurement of what's called the sepal and a measurement of the petals. Probably most of us are familiar with flower petals. We probably don't talk nearly as much about flower sepals. But what you can see represented here is for each of these observations a plotted point of how long the sepal is and how long the petal is. And then we can see from a number of different observations, we have a cluster of our red flower observations, our green flower observations, and our black flower observations. And by this, I don't necessarily mean that the flowers themselves were red, green, or black. It's just that the measurements clustered together. So we might have the red cluster, the green cluster, and the black cluster. Now, number of clusters, how does that work? Or how do we decide, well, I saw that you chose 3 clusters. How did you decide how many clusters we should try and get? So that's an excellent question, and there's a process, a couple of different techniques where we can determine the best number of clusters to run the clustering model. So what we've represented for you here is a graph at the bottom that is depicting the total within sum of square errors. So that's, a mouthful for sure. And we can, bring this into a little bit simpler terms by saying, whenever we compare each of the measurements to the mean, the differences or the distance is expressed with the square errors. And so the way that we're determining, how do we get the least amount of error in our model is through a measurement called within sum of square errors, which means, the least amount of error for the distances within our group. And so what it does is it explains the amount of variance that's explained by each number of cluster. So there's a different degree of error if I have 2 clusters versus 3 clusters versus 4 clusters. And so we see in the chart that the first clusters provides and explains of a lot of information variance. So does the second cluster. So we're still doing quite a bit of work there. There's quite a bit of difference between what we see in 1 and 2. When we get to 3 clusters, we can tell that 3 clusters is doing quite a bit of work as well. But then when we start looking at 4, 5, and 6, we can tell that adding that 4th cluster, 5th cluster, or 6th cluster doesn't explain much of our variance. So what we're looking at is essentially the curve. When we have a fairly steep slope to the curve, our number of clusters, our incremental number of clusters, is still doing some real good work. But when that slope begins to plane out or level out, we're not getting much more benefit from adding additional clusters or a higher number of clusters. Now focusing on just simply, what does this all mean? So what we do is we take a look at this chart, we run this technique, we take a look at the chart, and then we see, okay, where does the slope begin to plane out? And wherever that is on that number of clusters, that helps you choose the proper number of clusters to run k-means with. Now there's also an inverse technique that's called the total between sum of square errors. So this one works basically the opposite of the previous one. What it's doing is measuring the amount of error between a particular measurement and all of the measurements that are not in its cluster or not in its group. So the ones that are further away, if you will. So you'll notice that the curve on this approach is pretty much the exact opposite, and that's because it's what I would call the external error, or outside the group or cluster error. And what you can see is as we go from 4 to 6 clusters, there's a considerable amount of variation between clusters, but beyond the 8 clusters, the amount of variation starts reducing. So we see that planing out of our line there, where we move from 8 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 12. We're not getting a lot of incremental value as we add clusters. So our conclusion there would be, in order to get the maximum amount of value without adding too many clusters, in this analysis we might center on 8, because we get lots of value between cluster 7 and 8, so adding the 8th cluster makes a bunch of sense. But when we look at how much more value do we get if we add the 9th, we can see we don't get a lot of additional value.